Hi everyone, and welcome back out to Harvest Hills Ranch. Do you know what type of fats you're eating in your diet? Well, today I'm going to help you better understand that. We're going to take a look at saturated fats, monounsaturated fats, and polyunsaturated fats. And by the time I get through this video, you're going to be able to easily know the difference between those and know exactly what various sources of those are in your diet. Hey everyone, I'm Dr. Arland Hill, and I have a passion for all things nutrition, health, and wellness related. And this conversation around fats frequently comes up with my patients, and I think it's time we dive deeper into this. So here's what I'm going to do to start us out. I'm going to walk through these different categories of fats, and I'm going to help you understand this at a deeper level, basically. But what I want to do is I want to not to confuse the conversation. I want to give you an idea of what is the difference between each fat, why it makes a difference, and then also give you exact sources in your diet that when you're looking for a particular type of fat, that you'll know exactly which one to go to and it won't be confusing for you. So to start this conversation off, we are going to begin with saturated fats. Now, saturated fats are going to be fats which are chains of carbon. These chains of carbon, which is also in part why they are energy, but these chains of carbon, when they're saturated, have no double bonds in them. And that is an important difference because that gives you an immediate clue as to what they should look like at room temperature. So with that being said, let me share, I've got 4 different saturated fats right here that I want to share with you, and you're going to notice a theme among these saturated fats. So the first one that I have is beef tallow. This is beef tallow from our grass-fed and grass-finished cattle, and we take the bones and we boil the bones and then render the tallow off of the stock, and that's what you have in here. And so just to show you with this, it is definitely saturated. And we are at room temperature, and there's the bottle, guys, upside down, and it's still in there. It's not going anywhere. So this is beef tallow, and we also do this with venison. So when I harvest deer, we do the same thing with the bones there. And this is with your ruminant animals, things like goats, sheep, or lamb. You can do the very same thing with them. So find a good source on those, take those bones and make your own beef tallow, and excellent for flavoring. Now, right in line with that, we're going to look at another bovine source or another cattle source, but this time we're going to be talking about something different, which is butter. And here we have, these are just sticks of butter or blocks of butter. And so the idea with this is same thing. If it was not solid at room temperature, it would not hold its form and hold its shape like this. But butter is a saturated fat. Now, the nice thing about using saturated fats, especially when you're cooking, is that they are stable. They can be heated to a much higher heat and not break down. And this all goes back to that lack of double bonds. So just again, think about that solid chain of carbons. And when you are saturated, you're more stable. And the more stable that fat is, the higher the amount of heat that it can handle before it breaks down or before it hits what's known as its smoke point. So we have butter, and then many people have heard about clarified butter. And clarified butter, you see I've got that there, the other name for that being ghee. And with clarified butter, all the different ways that you use butter, you can use ghee the same way. So anything that you want to pan fry with it, if you want to bake with it, this is a great addition to that. Now, you will notice from all the examples that I've given you with these saturated fats, these are all animal derived. And so that's a consistent theme that you're going to see with saturated fats. Now, the beef tallow, and whether, like I said, we could do a venison tallow or we could do lamb or goat, those are all ruminant animals, but animals nonetheless. And then, of course, your butter being another source from animals. Now, here, there are sources of saturated fats from plants, not many, but they do exist. And so one of the more common ones for this is going to be coconut oil. And so you'll notice with this one, same thing. Actually, I'll just pop the lid off of this and we can turn that upside down. And other than what was just loose on top there, you can see we've completely got a solid substance there. So that's a saturated fat as well. It will handle higher heat. One of the things that I do want to point out on this, and we can read this on the label, and this is also important to know because this is a common theme among fats as well, is that I'm sharing with you that these are saturated fat sources, but you're not going to find fats that are exclusively one type of fat. So, for example, of the 12 grams in here per serving, 8 grams of that is saturated fat. So the other 4 grams are going to be mono or poly or something else. But they're predominantly saturated fats. When I show you, or when I talk here in a moment about monounsaturated or polyunsaturated, those oils are predominantly that type of oil, but they have other forms of fats in them as well. So again, it makes the conversation easy when we just talk about a saturated fat source. Even though we know that there's other fats in there, it's a saturated fat source, right? It just makes for an easy conversation. Now, the other plant-based saturated fat that you can find is cocoa butter. That's another one, but these are among the easier ones that you're going to find and have more readily available to utilize. Okay, that's saturated fats. Let's take a look at our unsaturated fats. Now, within the unsaturated fat category, we have monounsaturated fats and polyunsaturated fats. And let's begin with the monounsaturated fat because those are a bit easier to understand. And as the name implies, we all know that mono means one. So what this means is that where that saturated fat had a consistent strand of carbons with no double bonds, here we have one double bond in that consistent strand of fats. And that double bond generally means that we have a bend structurally in that fat. And so that changes the nature of the fat. That can be a weak point. It doesn't mean that the fat's bad, so don't think that. But it means when we start talking about things like how susceptible it is to higher heats or how susceptible it is to oxygen exposure. The more of those double bonds that there are, the less heat exposure it can withstand and the more susceptible it is to the effects of oxygen, what's known as oxidation. So let's talk about these monounsaturates, and I have a couple of sources here. So we'll move these saturated out, and let's move these in. And I'm going to give you the 3 most common ones that are available. These are ones that I often talk about because they're just frankly easy to find. The first one, and right at the very top of the list, is going to be olive oil. Now, olive oil is high in what is known as oleic acid. And so if you've ever heard that term, oleic acid is a very prevalent fat in the body. Depending on what sources you read, you're probably looking at around somewhere between 18 to 20% of our fatty acids in our red blood cells are going to be made up of oleic acid, to which this is a predominant source. Between your olive oil and your avocado oil, and the same thing would be true for avocados if you're consuming avocados directly, these are going to be somewhere around 55 to 60% oleic acid. But these still are very good oils. They are stable when they're exposed to a lower heat. So for example, if you are sauteing something on the stovetop, they are going to withstand that lower heat. But if you're trying to fry something, not a good option for doing that. They're not going to handle the heat, and you're going to end up damaging the fat, and you're going to have a rancid fat. So we don't want to do that. We don't want to run the risk of that. Then the other oil in this same category, so we're still with these monounsaturated fats, the other oil that you can choose is macadamia nut oil. Now, you can also choose macadamia nuts. Quite frankly, it makes a lot of sense to choose the macadamia nut as well and have that as a part of your diet. But in cases where you want that macadamia nut flavor, where you want to use it for, if you're saying you're making a dressing and you want that flavor in your dressing, more of that nutty flavor, this is a great addition to use for that. But to the point of this video, these are your three primary sources for your monounsaturates. Now, let me also pull into the conversation the polyunsaturates, and here's something that is probably important to note for this video is I don't have sources of polyunsaturates to show you. And the reason I don't have sources of polyunsaturated oils to show you is because I don't bring these into our home. Quite frankly, these are overutilized in the standard American diet. If you're not conscientious about making choices for saturated fats and these monounsaturated fats, you'll end up over-consuming these polyunsaturated fats. And the difference with the polyunsaturated compared to that monounsaturated, that polyunsaturated, here again, as the name implies, poly meaning multiple, you have multiple double bonds in here. And these double bonds are also what we call points of unsaturation. And the more of these points of unsaturation that you have, the greater the probability that that oil is going to succumb to oxidation. Now, when we start looking at some of the oils that you may be familiar with in this category or that you may see in this category, we hear this term sometimes known as vegetable oils. Vegetable oil is a bit of it's a misnomer. It, quite frankly, is a deceptive term, to be honest with you. And the reason it's a deceptive term is because what vegetable oil is it is soybean, it's corn, it's safflower, it's sunflower, it's canola. Those are grains. Those are not vegetables. So when you hear that terminology, don't be fooled by that. You're actually more specifically talking about grain and seed oil when we talk about vegetable oil. But again, these are polyunsaturates. We don't need to be consuming these in our diet. These are not the oils that we have subsisted on for thousands of years. When we were eating animals, and that was when we had to hunt and to gather, we were eating saturated fat, like this beef tallow. When we were picking and gathering and we were eating nuts, we were eating things, or we were eating some nuts and fruits, we were eating things like avocado oil and macadamia nut oil. So those are going to be your monounsaturated and your saturated. We didn't have a diet that was high in polyunsaturated fats. So it's not that you have to avoid those 100%, and quite frankly, trying to do that's an effort and futility. You're not going to completely eliminate those, but you shouldn't be going out of your way to look to add those in your diet. And you also should not be, you shouldn't be choosing those and bringing in those types of oils into your home, because apart from what I've shared with you here about the increased risk of oxidation, they do have other problems with them. Now, does this mean that all these oils in this polyunsaturated category are bad? It doesn't. And in fact, when we hear conversations around omega-3s and omega-6s, guys, that's in the polyunsaturated fat category, but those are at a different point in the process. So for example, things like the fish oils where we have EPA and DHA, and by the way, you also find these in grass-fed animals as well, and free-ranging animals, cold water fish, these oils are in there. So point being on this is that these polyunsaturated oils like your omega-3s, they have health benefits that are well established. There are some omega-6s, again, polyunsaturates here, polyunsaturated oils, that things like gamma-linoleic acid or dihomogamma-linoleic acid, those are going to have health benefits, but you're not going out of your way to eat linoleic acid. That's what we want to try to avoid. We don't want to have a diet that's high in these polyunsaturates and high in linoleic acid. Focus on these other parts of the diet, these other saturated and unsaturated oils. You'll find that your fatty acid status ends up looking a lot better. You'll also find that when it comes to rebuilding and regenerating human tissue, we need saturated fats. We need stability in our cell membranes. The more stable our cell membrane is, the less fragile it is, the less prone to oxidation and oxygen damage that it is. So we want healthy cell membranes that are resilient, and saturated fats and our monounsaturated fats are going to be the predominant oils that are going to help us do that. So, a lot of information here, but keep it simple: saturated, unsaturated, saturated or unsaturated, and in the unsaturated category, you have mono or poly. And that's really what we need to be talking about here Any conversation around trans fats is really for another day, and if you're focusing on these ones that we've talked about, those aren't going to be much of a concern for you anyway. Now, some of you, before I completely conclude this video, some of you are going to ask, well, what about nuts? What about things like pecans and Brazil nuts and cashews and pistachios and almonds and all these other nuts out there? And what you have to think about with these is that they are going to have varying degrees of mono and polyunsaturated fats. So whereas the seed oils that I mentioned, the grains, those tend to be predominantly in the polyunsaturated category or have a predominance for polyunsaturated fats, and things like the macadamia nut having a predominantly monounsaturated profile. For the most part, your other nuts that I mentioned there are going to be a blend of the mono and the poly. They may have a little bit of saturated fat in there as well, depending on what nut you're consuming. But by and large, we want to consume some of those. We can consume some of those for the most part without any issues. But again, we don't want to be overly consuming those nuts, the oils from those nuts, or the seed milks, if you will, the nut milks from those as well. So some additional thought on that. Hey, listen guys, if you are looking for more information around nutrition, how to better understand it, how to put it in use with your own diet and make more sense out of it, you can go to drarlandhill.com and have a better understanding of how I help my patients. And if you want to find sources of grass-fed and finished beef, and you want to be able to find the bones and things of this nature to make your own beef tallow, go to harvesthillsranch.com and you can find out how we raise animals with uncompromising principles, and you'll learn more about the whole regenerative agricultural process as a whole and why it's so important to do that the right way to create optimal health for us as humans. So until next time, everyone, I'm Dr. Arland Hill. I look forward to speaking with you in the future.